Well, good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page, coming back to you live again. It is Wednesday morning, February 17th, 2021, and we're covered up in snow again. Got about 3 more inches of snow last night. I love it. I know not everybody does. Hey, Brian. Hey, Aunt Gail. Hey, wife Gail. So we've got 2 Gail Odells in my family. One is my wife, who lives with me, and one is my aunt, who lives up in Ohio. One of the 2 spells their name incorrectly. I don't know which one it is. But they're both on the live stream today. Good to see both of you. Hey, Danny and Lyle, good to see y'all. Hey, listen, if you have any questions or comments today as we're going through, please use the comment section. Use the comment section, and I will recognize those as I see them. We're covering Matthew chapter 24, working our way through Matthew's account of the life of Christ. Hey, Wayne, how are you? And Mark, Marisa, good to see everybody joining in. Linda, watching in Tennessee. All right. We are ready for Matthew chapter 24, which I told you yesterday. We get to Matthew chapter 21. Jesus has his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Hey, Diana. Thank you for sharing, Diana and Brian. Jesus makes his triumphal entry into the city of Jerusalem, and he spends every day coming back and forth in and out of the city teaching. And as we covered Matthew 23 yesterday, we saw his very stern rebukes. Hey, Jerry and Louise. Very stern rebukes of the scribes and the Pharisees and their hypocrisy. And he told them at the end of Matthew 23 that Jerusalem was going to be left desolate. Their house, the temple, is going to be destroyed. Hey, Shelley. So this is Matthew chapter 24. He was in the temple teaching, Matthew 23, and now he is departing from the temple, Matthew chapter 24. Hello, Miss Marilyn. Good to see you on here today. Departing out of the temple, Matthew 24, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple, and Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Now, verse 3 there is important because we look at Mark's account, and Mark tells us that it's Peter, James, John, and Andrew who asked him privately. So let me say this first before we really get into the text of Matthew chapter 24. And let me throw this up on the screen too. We're going to have a PowerPoint to help us out today because there's so much information here. I don't know that there's a better chapter that helps us understand why there is so much benefit in having 3 different, actually 4 if you include John, different accounts of the life of Christ. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all cover the discussion that we're about to study here in Matthew chapter 24. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna use this PowerPoint, show you some things, and hopefully it'll help you understand what's going on here. Let me say this. This video might be a little bit longer than normal. We'll just see. There are a lot of misused verses in the Bible. Okay, I'll just give you one example real quick. Hey, Sheila and Barry and Glenda. Glad to see you guys. One of the most misused verses in all the Bible, of course, is John 3:16. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life." And so, as I'm sure most people well know, a lot of people take that verse and they say, well, see, all you have to do is believe in Jesus and you'll be saved. To the exclusion of everything else the New Testament has to say about salvation, they'll take one verse and put upon it an interpretation that is incorrect. Faith alone saves nobody. Never has, never will. So there are misused verses, is what I'm saying. If I had to say that there is a most misused chapter in the Bible, I would say it's Matthew chapter 24. There are 2 extreme positions when looking at Matthew 24. One extreme position is this. This is all future. I mean, we know very well that there are a lot of people who still look for signs. They're waiting for indicators as to when Jesus is coming back. War breaks out in the Middle East. Oh, Jesus must be coming back soon. There's a terrible earthquake or some type of natural disaster. Well, the time's getting close. That's one extreme of Matthew chapter 24, because we've just read verse Verse 2, Jesus told his disciples, not one stone shall be left here. Where? Well, the temple, verse 1, its buildings, verse 1. Not one stone shall be left upon another here, it says, that shall not be thrown down. Let me get my speaker off here real quick. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He has just, in fact, you go back up again into chapter 23, verses 37 through 39. There's no question what he's talking about here. This is a past event, okay? Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. So it's an extreme position on Matthew 24 to say that these things that we're getting ready to study are future, that we're still looking forward to them. Now, here's another extreme position on Matthew chapter 24, the whole chapter. And by the way, there are, 51 verses in Matthew 24. But again, not only do we have Matthew 24, we have Mark 13, and we have Luke chapter 21. So we're going to break it down like this on our PowerPoint here to help us follow, to help us stay in order. Extreme number 1, all of this is future. Extreme number 2, everything in Matthew 24 is already past. Okay? There's middle ground here. All right? There is middle ground here. Okay, I already got a question. Hey, David, would you not agree that faith alone saved the thief on the cross prior to the Great Commission? Well, he did talk to Christ directly, and here's the thing. You read Mark chapter 2 and verse 10, David, and it says that the Son of Man, while on earth, has power to forgive sins. Yeah, that thief certainly believed in Jesus. And I understand where you're coming from, David, so this is not aimed at you, but if you can talk to Jesus on earth today, he can pronounce your sins forgiven. But that's not going to happen. So he certainly understood, I think, who Jesus was. He said to the other thief, listen, we're here justly. This man's innocent. He's done nothing wrong. We are not saved like the thief on the cross today. All right, back to Matthew chapter 24. All these things are going to be thrown down. So his disciples want to follow up on that. And again, this is Peter, Andrew, James, and John who privately come to him, according to Mark 13 and verse 3. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, I'm reading from the New King James Version. It uses the word age. I know the King James uses the word world. This is not cosmos here. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. We'll work all this out as we go through the text. So here's your question. Matthew 20, I'm going to use my cursor here over here. Matthew 24 has it in verse 3. Mark 13 has it in verses 3 and 4. Luke chapter 21 has it in verse 7. He then begins to tell them. They want to know the details. So he gives them the details. He talks about there are going to be sorrows. And we're not going to read all of these verses because, again, there are 51 verses in Matthew 24 alone. But we're going to break it down. He's just told them, this is what's going to happen to the city of Jerusalem. I've got 2 ribbons in my Bible, so I can turn quickly to Mark 13 and Luke 21. Let me look here real quick. Okay. The way Luke records it is, tell us when these things are about to take place. That's important too. So again, there's great benefit in having these 3 accounts. So he talks about sorrows in Matthew 24, verses 4 through 8. And we're primarily going to follow Matthew 24 today, but then we will jump over to Mark 13 and Luke 21 because they are talking about the same events with a little bit different detailing. So verses 4 through 8, he says there are going to be sorrows. He talks about deception in those verses. He talks about wars and rumors of wars. Don't be troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Well, the end of what? Go back up to verse 2. Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. That's the end that's being discussed here. You're going to hear of all these things. And not only that, you're going to hear of nation rising against nation, famines, pestilences, earthquakes, etc. All these are the beginning of sorrows. If you want to read just, for instance, about pestilence, or rather famines, read Acts chapter 11, verses 27 through 30. There was actually a prophecy of a famine that would take place in Judea. You can Google earthquakes of the first century. You can find information that shows what Jesus is saying here. All these things are going to happen before the end comes. Well, what is the end? Your house is left desolate, Matthew chapter 23 and verse 38. Not one stone is going to be left upon another, Matthew 24 and verse 2. This is, pretty straightforward stuff here. He then talks about persecution in Matthew 24, verses 9 through 14. They'll deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. You jump down to Matthew 24 and verse 13. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. Well, to the end of what? They're going to kill you. They're going to persecute you. You endure through all that unto the end, even if it may be the end of your life, and you will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. This word end keeps popping up. The end of what? Well, contextually, Matthew 23:38, your house is left desolate. Matthew 24 and verse 2, not one stone shall be left here upon another. The end is the destruction of Jerusalem, which also included the destruction of the temple by the Romans in AD 70. So you have, again, looking at my screen over here, Matthew, Mark, Luke, they all record this in their own chapters, talking about persecution. I'm going to turn over just real quick to Luke's account. I'm going to go to Luke 21, beginning in verse 20. He talks about it here. Now listen to Luke's record of it here. Luke 21 and verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. So when we're reading Matthew's account and we're reading about the end, we can supplement that with Luke's account of the same stuff. What is the end? What's he talking about? When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that its desolation is near. Whereas Matthew says, where am I? Okay. The persecution, Matthew 24 and verse 13, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. The end will come, Matthew 24 and verse 14. This is the benefit of having three gospel accounts, again. And of course, looking at Luke's, or including Luke's account here, we know it's talking about this localized judgment against Jerusalem, its desolation. If you're in Judea, get to the mountains. Luke records that. And, again, those who are looking for this to be some future event, when the Lord comes back in the future, there is no escaping. In fact, Luke's going to give us a word on that we'll look at later. All right, so back to Matthew chapter 24. We've looked at the question, we've looked at the sorrows, we've looked at the persecution. And then all three writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, reference Daniel. Matthew starts in verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place. They are talking about the destruction of the temple, Matthew 24 and verse 2. And then he talks about these people standing, the abomination of desolation, standing in the holy place. Well, what is the holy place in Jerusalem? It's in the temple. The abomination of desolation was prophesied by Daniel on two different occasions and about two different instances. It's recorded in Daniel chapter 9, but also in Daniel chapter 11. And that's an interesting thing. I've actually been asked to teach on Daniel after I finish Matthew. And I guess that's what I'm going to do. Anyway, the Roman armies are going to be in the holy place. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. If you're in the field, don't go back to get clothes. If you're pregnant, it's going to be trouble. If you're nursing infants, it's going to be trouble. Then Matthew 24:21, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world, until this time, no nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. For the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. See, here's the thing. Jesus is talking here privately to Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Mark chapter 13 and verse 3. He is telling his disciples, when you see this, when you see the temple surrounded, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, get out of town. And even history tells us that Christians survived this assault on Jerusalem by the Romans. I think it was 1.1 million killed, and I think it was 97,000 inhabitants of Jerusalem who were taken captive by the Romans. It was a terrible time, there's no question about it. And Daniel prophesied of it. Again, Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke chapter 21, they all record this in the same way. Let's see. Okay, don't believe false prophets. Still looking at Matthew 24, we're down to verse 23. Hey, there's false Christ. Don't believe it. False Christ will arise, false prophets will rise, etc. And look at verse 25. Matthew 24 and verse 25 is an important verse. See, I have told you beforehand. They knew. They knew the signs. They knew when this was all going to happen, because there are going to be people in places they shouldn't be in. Going back up to verse 15 of Matthew chapter 24, the Roman armies are going to be surrounding the temple. You're going to know this. The time is going to be obvious to you when it's time for not one stone shall be left upon another. Let's see. Verse 26, Matthew 24:26. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out, or look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes on the west, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man. The lightning comes from the east to the west. You see a lightning flash in the sky. Everybody in the region is going to see it. Not everybody in the world is going to see it. Everybody in Jerusalem is going to know what's happening. They're going to know that there's something going on. Peter, Andrew, James, and John are told specifically what's going to go on. And Jesus is coming. He was coming in judgment against Jerusalem. Now, the next few verses here in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21 help us understand, because here's one of those extremes of Matthew 24. They say the whole chapter is about the destruction of Jerusalem, and they say that was when Christ came back, and he's not coming back again. This is an extreme position, and I know there are a lot of folks out there who believe it earnestly. They're sincere in it, but they're sincerely wrong, and we're going to see why today. The coming of the Son of Man will be, verse 27. Well, there are multiple occasions, particularly in your Old Testament, when the Lord came in judgment. And this same language is used. So just for instance, you get down to Matthew 24, verses 29 through 31. And I have here on your, it gives my cursor here, I have this word here, cosmic. All right? Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. All right, so let's look at that now. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. What is Jesus talking about here? Go back to Matthew 24 and verse 2. Not one stone shall be left upon another. So what is this? What are these cosmic events that he's talking about? This is prophetic language. So I have this written down. I have it actually written in Luke's account. Here's some verses you can write down. If you want to look at this on your own and compare the language and see that this is language that is used in terms of judgment, here's some verses for you. Isaiah 13, verses 9 and 10. Ezekiel 32, 7 and 8. Joel chapter 2, verses 30 and 31. Isaiah chapter 34 and verse 4. And there are more than that in the Old Testament, but that's 4 or 5 for you to look at to understand that when God was coming in judgment against a city or a nation like Babylon, like Egypt, some of those passages that I just gave you were talking about that. This is the type of language that is used. The temple's going to be destroyed. This is going to shake the Jewish world, because Jerusalem was the center of their life for 1,500 years, and it's going to be wiped out. Now, that had happened multiple times over their history, where Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed, and things like this. And Jesus is telling them, here are all the indicators that this is going to happen. And then he tells them a parable. And it's interesting here. Well, I'm sorry. Let's not get to the parable yet. We'll get to that in just a minute. So we read verse 29 of Matthew 24. And then it says in verse 30, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Again, this is the same language that's used in the Old Testament about various other judgments against nations. Now remember, what we're reading here in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21 is a localized judgment against the city of Jerusalem. Those who believe that this is his second coming and he's not coming back take it to an extreme, and they use verses like this. See, he said he was coming then in power and great glory. Well, the same language is used in the Old Testament against other nations. This is judgment language. Yes, he came in judgment against Jerusalem, and he told us that he was going to. You read Matthew, for instance, you read Matthew 23, verses 31 through 36, and he says, I'm coming. Your blood is going to be brought on your own heads. All these things are going to come upon this generation, Matthew 21, verse 36. He will send his angels with great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Again, when you go back up to Matthew 24 and verse 25, he's telling them, when you see all these things, I've told you ahead of time, get out of town. Get out of town. This is a localized judgment against the city of Jerusalem. Now, let's look at the parable, okay? He tells a parable of a fig tree, and he says, when its branches have already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. There are indications that it's, we might say harvest time. Fruit's ready to be picked, all right? So you also, when you see all these things that we've been talking about, reading about, the signs, know that it is near at the doors. What is near? What is at the doors? Your house is left unto you desolate, and not one stone shall be left upon another. All right? And then he says this, Matthew 24 and verse 34, surely I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. All what things? Everything we've been reading about. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. Jesus is giving the certainty of what he's saying here. It is going to happen. Here's how it's going to happen. You're going to see it before it happens. You're going to know it's getting ready to happen, and you can get out of town. My word will by no means pass away. Now, this phrase, heaven and earth shall pass away. I want to show you a passage of Scripture that will help you understand what he means by saying heaven and earth will pass away. I'm going to go over to Luke chapter 16 and verse 16. It says, the law and the prophets were until John. Since that time, the kingdom of God has been preached, and everyone is pressing into it. John's work, John the Baptizer that is, John's work was transitional. He was the forerunner for the Christ. He's preaching a new message. Christ preached the same message. And, now listen to Luke 16, verse 17. It is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one tittle of the law to fail. So this is what we're reading here in Matthew 24 and verse 35. My words, it would be easier if the heavens and earth passed away than if what I'm telling you didn't happen. This is affirming the certainty of what's going to take place in the city of Jerusalem, that they could see the armies would surround Jerusalem. In fact, that is specifically how Luke records it. Luke 21 and verse 20, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you know that its desolation is near. There is no question about what's happening here. And then he tells the parable, parable of the fig tree. And then we have this, but. There's a lot of controversy over this word. There shouldn't be. I'm gonna give you a little detail here about the word but, because those who believe that Matthew 24 is talking about the second coming of Christ and that he's not coming back in the future, they get hung up on this word but. They don't understand what it means. They say, oh, that's a conjunction, and it just adds to. It's like the word and. I was actually talking to a guy about this online, and that's what he was saying. Well, it's a conjunction. It's like and. It just shows continuation. Well, that can be true, but context will tell you whether or not it's a conjunction. Just to give you a couple ideas here, this word but, I'm going to read this. This is from Spiros Zodhiates in his word studies of the Greek New Testament. This word but, it's a particle. Okay, a particle in the Greek language, it's not a noun, it's not a verb or an adjective. It's kind of one of the what's called ins and outs of the Greek language. It's a particle that stands after one or two words. It's called a postpositive. All right? It's not, it'll never be the first word in a sentence. It's usually the second or third word. Stands after one or two words in a clause, strictly adversative, but frequently denoting transition or conversion, and serving to introduce something else, whether opposed to what precedes, or simply continuative or explanatory. So it can be either or. It can be a conjunction, which joins two thoughts, or it can be a transitional term. Context will tell you. Mounce. William Mounce in his lexicon says it's a conjunctive particle making the superaddition of a clause, whether in opposition or continuation to what is preceded. And I'm going to show you why this is important. I know this is a lot of minutia, we might say, but it's important. And then BDAG, Browning, Driver, Arndt, and Gingrich says it is a particle used to connect one clause with another when it is felt. There is some contrast between them. It's translated as but when contrast is clear. It's translated as and when a connection is desired. So what? Well, here's the so what. Jesus told his disciples, again, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, privately, Mark 13, verse 3, when Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, you are going to know it. The holy place is going to be surrounded. Armies are going to surround the city, Luke tells us in Luke 24 and verse 20. It's kind of like a fig tree that's coming in bloom. You know spring's near, or you know summer's near. Well, this is what I'm talking to you about, not one stone being left upon the other. This is the same thing. So we're going to move on here, because that's the first word in our English in Matthew 24 and verse 36. But of that day and hour, listen to this, folks. Listen to this. No one knows. Of that day and hour, no one knows. Have we not just read a bunch of verses that said you will know? So these guys who believe that everything happened in AD 70, they say, well, what that means is they wouldn't know the exact day the temple would be destroyed. Yeah, they would see all these things, but they wouldn't know the exact time when these things would happen. Well, let me take you over to Luke chapter 21 again, and verse 34. Take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighted down with carousing, drunkenness, and the cares of this life, and that day come on you unexpectedly. What does it mean that something comes upon you unexpectedly? You don't know it. Now, he's just told them, you will know when Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. You will see the armies. It's like a fig tree coming in bloom. There's no question. You will know. And then you will not know. It will come upon you unexpectedly. In fact, Luke says this, for it will come to you as a snare on those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. What is a snare? Well, it's a trap that you set to catch an animal either around the foot or neck. It's completely unexpected. Back to Matthew 24. Of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. All right, so let's look at it. Let me pull a couple things up here. Matthew and Mark say, but of that day. Luke doesn't say this. Now, here's the interesting thing about the phrase, but of that day. Here's the Greek phrase, peride tes hemeris ekenes, concerning but the day that one. Now, you read the preceding verses to verse 36, and it's those days, those things, these days, these things. You will know. There are signs. There are indicators. And everything after this point in Matthew and Mark's account say, of that day, you won't know. All right? Those days and these things as opposed to that day. Now, let me show you this here too, as I pulled it up on the screen. Listen to Mark 13 and verse 32 and 33. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, not the Son, but the Father only. Take heed, watch, and pray. Now listen to this. Listen to this. Mark 13:33. For you do not know when the time is. Now you read all the verses before that in Mark chapter 13, and they would know when the time is. Because there are signs, there are indicators. There's a Roman army surrounding the temple and in the holy place. You're going to know. Get out of town. There's another day when you will not know the time. And then I go to Luke chapter 21 and verse 35. For it will come as a snare. I've already read this, but let's do it again. As a snare on all those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. There's another day coming that's going to affect the whole earth that will not be known until it happens. As opposed to a day that will affect Jerusalem and everybody's going to see it coming. To believe that Matthew 24 is talking all about one event and that Jesus is not talking about also a future event here is to completely ignore Mark and Luke's account, but also to just disregard what Matthew says. Now let me do this too. You keep going back, let's go back to Matthew 24. You keep going on in the text, and I heard a guy explaining this the other day in one of his sermons. He got to Matthew 24 and verse 37. He says, "But as the days of Noah were, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them away. So also will be the coming of the Son of Man." And he was explaining that as if this is talking about Noah himself, that Noah knew when the Lord was coming. Noah knew 7 days ahead. It shows that this guy in particular doesn't know how to handle the Word of God correctly. Listen to this. "For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage." Question: who got into the ark? You got Noah and his wife, their 3 sons and their 3 wives. If that applies to Noah, then they must have been polygamists because they were marrying and giving in marriage. What we're reading here in Matthew 24 and verse 38 is the people of Noah's day, not Noah himself. And notice the language beyond that. They were eating and drinking until the day that Noah entered the ark. They were eating and drinking until Noah entered the ark. That's how the Son of Man is going to come. They saw Noah out there building an ark. They had never seen it rain before. They didn't know what was going to happen until it happened. Jerusalem, they knew what was getting ready to happen before it happened. The second coming of Christ, nobody knows. Concerning but the day that one, as opposed to the many days that Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk about prior to this day that nobody knows about. So let's look at this. Details. Now, as you look at the screen here, you see that Matthew has a lot more than Mark and Luke do. And that's okay, but there is some supplement in Mark and Luke's account when we get down here further. So Matthew 24, verses 37 through 39, those people of Noah's day, not Noah, okay? The people of Noah's day didn't know what was going to happen until it happened. Remember what Luke said. It's unexpected and it's like a snare. Took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. He then talks here in Matthew 24, verses 40 and 41 about separation. And I got to be honest with you. I've started talking about, I try. Sometimes I slip up and I forget. Sometimes I slip up and forget. I've kind of stopped talking about it as the day of judgment because I think we get this mental picture in our mind that when the Lord comes back, there's going to be 2 long lines of people, and everybody's going to go one by one, and we're going to have to give an account one by. That's not really the imagery that we're given here. Beginning here in verse 40, and then on into Matthew chapter 25, this is a day of separation. When he comes back again, we're all going to appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Okay, 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10. But we're going to be separated. All right? It's not a one person by one person day of judgment. We decide where we're going to spend eternity right now. You and I do. So long as we're alive, we make those decisions each day. So Matthew 24 helped me see that it's more a day of separation than it is a day of judgment where we all stand in a line and wait our turn, like we're at the DMV or something. Verses 42 through 44, again, it's unexpected. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known, and again, think about all the signs and indicators we read in the first part of this chapter. You will know, you will know, you will know. There's no question. There are signs. If the master, but know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore, you also be ready, for the Son of Man, here it is again, is coming at an hour you do not expect. That is not talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, because they knew. They were expecting it. That's why they were told, when you see these things, flee to the mountains. There's a major difference between when you see these things, flee to the mountains, between that and be ready, because he's coming when you don't expect it. One's expected, one's unexpected. And you can't make this unexpected day the destruction of the temple, because he already told them it's going to be surrounded. The holy place, there are going to be people in the holy place that shouldn't be there. But again, like I said, there are two extremes to this passage. One still looking for all these things to happen, the signs, and then others saying it's all past already. And then what Matthew does, verses 45 through 50, he uses language that tells us it's not aware, that you will not be aware. Look at verse 50, for instance. The master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, at an hour that he is not aware of. They were aware of the destruction of Jerusalem. They were aware of the destruction of the temple. And then Matthew ends like this. And will cut him in two and appoint him the portion with the hypocrites. There shall be wailing, weeping, and gnashing of teeth. Then Matthew 25 launches into the picture of division. 5 wise, 5 foolish virgins. The parable of the talents, the 5, 2, and 1 talent man. It's a day of separation. Now let's look. I'm going to look real quick at at Mark's account here. Mark 13. I love the way Mark does it. Verse 33. Take heed, watch, and pray, for you do not know when the time is. You do not know when the time is. I don't have to add anything to that. It's like a man going into a far country. We're in Mark 13, verse 34. Who left his house and gave authority to his servants and to each his work, and commanded the doorkeeper to watch. Watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming. In the evening, midnight, crowing of the rooster, the morning. Lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And what I say to you, I say to all, watch. You don't know the time, so you have to be ready. That's Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke chapter 21. It's important to study all three of those accounts together, because again, there are little indicators throughout. Let me look here real quick. Okay, so I'm over in Luke chapter 21, and I know I mentioned this earlier, but this is such an important point to understand. That what happened in AD 70 that Jesus is talking about in the first parts of these chapters was prophesied specifically, and indeed did take place. So listen to Luke 21, beginning in verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Okay, now compare that to the same chapter in verse 35. For it will come as a snare on all those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. You have the whole earth in verse 35. You have Jerusalem in verse 20. You have know that the desolation is near, verse 20. Then you have in verse 35, it's coming as a snare. This is not hard to understand, folks. Here's the thing. And let me kind of close like this, and then I'll address the comments. And I know this video is a little bit longer today, but it needs to be. When you approach the Bible from a preconceived position, okay? And again, the two extremes on Matthew 24. All of these things are future. We're still watching for signs of the end and all of this. And then the other extreme is, well, all that's happened. Jesus came back then, and he's not coming again in the future. Those are two extreme positions. The truth is always somewhere in the middle. But when you approach the Bible when you already have your mind made up, okay, the AD 70 guys, for instance, let me preface this with this. The reason I talk about AD 70, or have been throughout the study of Matthew, is because they have approached me. They found my Facebook page and my YouTube channel, and they've sent me private messages, and I'm fine with that. Hey, I'm absolutely fine to having discussion, to them watching and critiquing my videos. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But this is a reason why I cover it, because they have approached me. One of them tried to convert me to his way of thinking. That's why it's important to focus on this. But when you approach the Bible from your preconceived position, okay, the AD 70 guys, that's all they see. If you'd be interested in their names, I'll give you their names privately. I'm not going to do it publicly. But when you hear them preach or teach or do a live stream, this is all they talk about. Every time. And they want to debate everybody. If you disagree with them, hey, how about we have a discussion? How about we have a public debate? They want more attention. When you approach the Bible from the perspective of your certain filter, okay, Calvinism, for instance, all right? A lot of people believe in the doctrine of Calvinism, that you have a sinful nature and you can't do anything until God chooses you, elects you, and saves you. And then you can't fall from that once you're saved. Well, the person who has that perspective sees the entire Bible through that lens. The person who believes in AD 70 that Jesus is not coming back in the future, they look at everything in the Bible through that lens. You cannot do that. You have to respect the context of every passage. So that's why it's important to study these details and to break things down like we've broken them down and just look at the language. I mean, all these things I've put up here for you. You don't know. There are no signs. There are no indicators. It's going to come as a snare on the whole earth versus you will know you can get out of town and it's going to be in the city of Jerusalem. You know, honesty demands that you see that distinction. The sad reality is when you have a lens over your spiritual eyesight, when you're looking through a specific lens and you're looking for your doctrine, then that's all you'll see. And that's all you'll talk about. Don't do that, all right? Don't be like that. Let the text lead you. Don't let your preconceived concept of the text lead you. Just look at the language. Either you could know about it or you can't. Or maybe he's talking about two different things here. All right? There are a lot of other places we could go to disprove this AD 70 belief. And here's one thing that I've been told by this one guy in particular. Listen, if I'm wrong, I'll change. Well, no, he won't. Well, he won't. Which is sad. It is sad. Look at the language of the biblical text. Let it lead you. Let it tell you. Signs, indicators. Hey, a tree's blooming in spring. You know summer is near. So also will my judgment be against the city of Jerusalem. Versus, nobody knows. No signs. If the master of the house had known when the thief was coming, he would have been ready. You don't know when a thief is coming. I heard a guy the other day, I watched this it's like a 10 or 11 minute video, and he dealt with the thief in the night. He said he came to his church building one day, real early in the morning. He said it was like 4 a.m. And he said there was somebody sitting in the car outside the parking lot. And he said when I came in the building, they went by real slow, and then they finally left. He said, I knew that might have been a thief. Do you? Was that an indicator that somebody was getting ready to break into your building? Well, of course not. And it was a silly illustration and made no sense at all. But that's what people do, again, when they approach Scripture from their shaded lens, if you will. Don't do that. Look at the language. Unexpected, not aware. The face of the whole earth versus expected. You will be aware. In fact, you can get out of town. And it's local. City of Jerusalem. All right, guys. That's enough. I've gone for 45 minutes. I knew it might be a little bit longer today. I wasn't sure how long, but I appreciate y'all being on here today. Let me look at the comments real quick. There is as much evidence that the thief was baptized, John's baptism, as there is that he was. That's true. And like I said earlier, it doesn't matter either way, whether he was baptized into John's baptism or not. Because when you look at Mark chapter 10 and verse 2, while Jesus was on earth, he had the power to forgive sin. He could say it, your sins are forgiven. And guess what? Your sins would be forgiven. David says, let's see, speaking of the cataclysmic event of Jerusalem that you're speaking of, some contend that the book of Revelation was written in the late 60s before the destruction. Yes, David, that's true. If it was written in the 90s, they claim there is no mention of this cataclysmic event which happened to Jerusalem. Surely it would have been mentioned in the book of Revelation, such an enormous event like that, if it was written in the 90s. Here's another thing, David. Let me tell you this. Not only does the Bible, if you take the AD 70 position, you have to say all the books were written before AD 70. Because, like you're saying, no book talks about it afterwards. Get this. There is not one bit of historical support apart from the Bible in the first 3 centuries after AD 70. I did some reading. There's no, I wrote this down, no first century writer wrote of the event having taken place, but then no non-canonical, in other words, non-biblical writer in the second, third, or fourth century talked about a past day of judgment. They all spoke of a future day of judgment still. I'll just give you some examples. Clement of Rome, he lived from AD 30 to 100, and multiple times he talks about a day of judgment, and he talks about them all in the future. Polycarp lived from AD 65 to 155. He wrote a letter to the church at Philippi, and on several different occasions, he talks about a day of judgment in the future tense. He never looks back in the past of a judgment and Christ coming. Ignatius lived from AD 30 to 107. He wrote a letter to the Ephesians, the Magnesians, the Trallians, the Romans, the Smyrnians. Several letters he wrote, and I've got this set of books here, 38 volumes. Multiple times he mentions a future day of judgment when Christ will return, and he quotes passage after passage, just like Clement and Polycarp do. Ignatius wrote a letter to Polycarp. He talked about it. Justin the Martyr, in his first defense of Christianity, talked about a future day of judgment. In his dialogue with Trypho, he talked about a future day of judgment. I mean, there is absolutely zero historical evidence for the idea that Jesus came back in AD 70 and that he's not coming back again in the future. Zero evidence. All right. Good afternoon from Orlando. Hey, Sharon, glad to see you. Hey, Miss Marisa, thank you. Billy, appreciate that. Miss Sharon, people are going to keep teaching this. You're absolutely right, and that's the thing. I can't change anybody's mind, and that's not my goal. Now, I can present what the Bible says and say, hey, here's the evidence. Here's just what it says. If they believe this, they're going to keep believing it. If they're honest, hopefully they'll consider some of the things I said. The Bible, obviously being the inspired Word of God, we need to know it and be able to teach it effectively. But when you look at these historical things that I just mentioned to you, within 200 years of the first century, and they're still looking forward to a future day of judgment, it just completely destroys that whole position. All right, enough. Almost 50 minutes. Let's wrap it up. Appreciate y'all being on here today. If you have any further questions or comments about this subject, send me a private message. Comment here on our page, however you want to do it. I'll be happy to respond to you in any way. Comment just came in. Please explain the rapture, and are people going to be left behind? Okay, Diana, I think I'll do that in our After the Stream group. That's a great question. The rapture. I'm not going to do that right now. I've already been going for 50 minutes. If you got people who'd like to do these studies who don't do Facebook, send them over to our YouTube channel, Mammoth Spring Church of Christ. All this content is uploaded there. I plan on coming back tomorrow, Thursday, at 11 a.m., and we'll pick up in Matthew 25, but we're going to start Matthew 25 in verse 31. I've already covered those parables. They're up on our YouTube channel. And you can look at those parables there. Yeah, Billy Simpkins says one of the churches of Christ here are teaching the 70s doctrine. It's a very small group, but they're very vocal. I know they're in Michigan. There's 2 or 3 up in Michigan. There's one in Indianapolis. There's a guy in Texas that I know. There's a guy in Florida. So it's around. It is a very small minority, but they are out there. So be aware of it. All right, guys. Hope to see you back here tomorrow at 11 o'clock. We'll pick up in Matthew 25 and verse 31, and we'll talk about the day of separation and what's going to happen at the final judgment. Have a good day, and I will see you on the next video.